Here's Keynote 1 expanded to 500 words for, I worked for him, but he was the one in control of my heart. Hashtag Keynote 1. The power dynamic from the moment I started working for him, I knew it wasn't going to be a typical job. James Hartley was a man who commanded attention without trying. His presence filled the room the moment he walked in, and it was impossible not to notice. The way he carried himself, the sharp lines of his tailored suit, the way he spoke, authoritative yet calm. Everything about him screamed power. When I first met him, I was intimidated. I had just graduated and landed my first real job as his assistant. At the time, I was thrilled, proud of myself for getting the position at such a prestigious firm. I admired him from afar, telling myself I was just focused on doing my job, proving myself, and learning from the best. But James had a way of making you feel seen. I wasn't just another face in the office. He would stop by my desk, offering a compliment about my work or asking how I was doing. Nothing big, nothing too personal, but it was enough to make my heart race. A small smile from him could turn my whole day around, and it didn't take long before I realized that his subtle attention was more powerful than anything I'd ever felt. He wasn't overt. He didn't flirt or make advances, but there was something about the way he looked at me, the way he held my gaze, that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. I tried to keep my feelings in check. I knew I had to. He was my boss, after all, and I was just his assistant, there to make his life easier, not complicate it with any unwanted emotions. But every time I caught him watching me, whether it was during a meeting or across the office, it felt like the world slowed down. He never said much, but that look was enough. I couldn't help it. I was falling hard. The professional line between us seemed clear, yet the more I tried to ignore the growing pull, the stronger it became. James was always in control, at work, in meetings, in the way he commanded the room. But it wasn't just his professional dominance that made him captivating. It was the way he made you feel like you mattered. In a world where everyone was scrambling to get ahead, James was a calm, steady force. People gravitated toward him, trusted him, and without realizing it, I was no different. I tried to keep my distance. I buried myself in work, focusing on organizing his schedule, coordinating his meetings, and handling the endless stream of requests. It was easy to drown in the day-to-day tasks, to convince myself I was just doing my job. But there were moments when he would come into my office, alone, and I'd see a side of him that wasn't just the boss. He'd ask about my weekend plans or make a quick comment about a project, and suddenly, the walls between us would feel thinner. I started noticing how my heart would race when he came near, how my palms would sweat if I had to give him a document or pass him in the hallway. He didn't know it, but every move he made, every subtle compliment, every brief touch of his hand on mine was like a spark to dry tinder, setting my emotions ablaze. It wasn't just about attraction anymore. It was about power. The way he held my attention without even trying, the way his every word felt like it carried weight. He was the one in control, not just of the office, but of me. I didn't want it to be true. I told myself I could handle it. But deep down, I knew I was already lost. Here's Keynote 2 expanded to 500 words for, I worked for him, but he was the one in control of my heart. Hashtag Keynote 2. The fine line between professional and personal, the more time I spent around James, the clearer it became that the line between professional and personal was thinner than I had ever imagined. I had always believed that work was work and personal life was personal, but with him, the boundaries blurred in a way that felt inevitable. Every interaction, every word seemed to carry weight. I couldn't help but wonder if it was all in my head, if I was reading too much into things. But there were moments that left no room for doubt, moments that made it impossible to ignore the growing connection between us. It started with small, seemingly innocent gestures. He'd ask me to join him for lunch, never in a group, always just the two of us. At first, I thought it was just a casual thing, a way to discuss work or bounce ideas around. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice the subtle undertones. The way he would ask about my personal life, the way his questions seemed more personal than professional. During those lunches, we would talk about everything: Work, of course, but also the little details that had nothing to do with business. What I liked to do on weekends, what kind of books I enjoyed, my family dynamics. It felt like we were moving into deeper territory, but I told myself that it was just part of the work relationship. He was my boss, and maybe this was just his way of getting to know the people around him, understanding what made them tick so he could better manage them. But the way he looked at me, really looked at me, made it hard to dismiss the idea that maybe this wasn't just about business. There was something in his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine, something that made me feel like I was the only one in the room, as if the rest of the world didn't matter when he was near. It was disarming, intoxicating even, and it only made me want more. There were other moments, too, more subtle, but just as powerful. A brush of his hand as he passed me a file, the way his voice would lower just slightly when he addressed me one-on-one. At the office, he was always professional, always the boss, always in control. But when it was just the two of us, it felt different, more intimate, more like we were two people trying to navigate the space between us, unsure of what to do with the undeniable chemistry that simmered beneath the surface. I had no illusions about what was at stake. I knew this wasn't just any workplace attraction. James was my superior. There were rules, expectations, and risks. I could lose my job, my reputation, and worse, I could destroy the trust and respect I had worked so hard to build in this company. But the pull between us was magnetic. It wasn't something I could turn off with logic or reasoning. It wasn't just about being around someone powerful. It was about him, about the way he made me feel like I mattered, like I was more than just an assistant, more than just a cog in a machine. The more I tried to distance myself, the more I realized how impossible it was. My emotions were tangled in a way that I couldn't unravel. It wasn't just his dominance that drew me in. It was his confidence, his intelligence, the way he seemed to understand everything without needing to say a word. But more than that, it was the way he seemed to see me like he knew me in a way no one else did. Like he had the power to make me forget everything I thought I knew about myself and just lose myself in him. As the days went by, the fine line between professional and personal became even harder to navigate. I knew I needed to focus on my work to remind myself why I was there in the first place. But the truth was, with every passing day, James Hartley was becoming harder and harder to ignore. And in some twisted way, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Here's Keynote 3 expanded to 500 words for, I worked for him, but he was the one in control of my heart. ##### Keynote 3. The unspoken tension, it wasn't just the moments when we were alone that made it clear the boundaries between work and personal life had been irreversibly blurred. It was the unspoken tension that filled the space between us every time we were in the same room. No one else seemed to notice, but I could feel it. The crackling electricity in the air, the subtle charge that passed between us with every glance, every fleeting touch. At first, I convinced myself that I was imagining it. Surely, I wasn't the only one who was sensitive to the dynamics between us. After all, we worked together every day. There was bound to be a level of comfort that developed over time. I told myself it was all professional, just two people getting to know each other better in a work environment. But there were moments I couldn't deny. The first time it happened, it was so small, so subtle, that I almost convinced myself it hadn't really occurred. I had been walking toward his office to deliver a report, my mind preoccupied with the task at hand, when I felt a hand brush against mine. The touch was brief, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shock wave through me. I froze for a moment, heart racing, unsure if I had imagined it. I looked up at him, but he didn't acknowledge the moment. He continued talking about the project, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The weight of that touch lingered on my skin, as if it had burned into me. I tried to convince myself that it was a mistake, that maybe it was just a simple, accidental brush of hands. But in the days that followed, it kept happening. Not just during the occasional handoff of papers or quick exchanges of information, but in the way he would linger just a little longer than necessary when speaking to me. The way his eyes would hold mine for just a fraction of a second longer, and how, sometimes, I'd catch a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips, like he knew something I didn't. And then there were the comments. Casual, seemingly offhand remarks that sent my heart racing and made me question whether he was aware of the effect he was having on me. "You always seem so organized," he would say with a smile, his gaze lingering on me a bit longer than usual. "I appreciate how you handle everything without getting flustered. It's impressive." He'd say it in front of the team, but the way his eyes rested on me as he spoke made me feel like I was the only one he saw. It was like he was giving me little compliments that weren't just about my work, but about me, the person he was starting to see behind the assistant he'd hired. I started to notice how the others in the office reacted, too. There was an undercurrent of curiosity, a whispered speculation about the way James treated me differently than the others. But no one ever outright mentioned it. I could tell people were aware, but no one dared to speak it aloud. The rumors and whispers felt like a heavy fog, hanging just beneath the surface, but I couldn't help but wonder if it was all in my head, if maybe I was overthinking everything. Despite my best efforts to remain professional, I started finding it harder to focus. Every glance from him, every unspoken word, felt like it was pulling me in deeper. And it wasn't just his touch or his words. It was the way he carried himself, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the room who mattered. The way he saw me, really saw me, in a way no one else ever had. The more he gave me this attention, this subtle, undeniable attention, the more I felt like I was losing myself. Like I was becoming more and more tangled in the space between us, caught in the orbit of someone who was in complete control. The worst part? I didn't want to escape it. Every time I tried to distance myself, I only found myself drawn back in. The tension between us, the pull that seemed to exist even in the silence, was too powerful to ignore. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something that felt like it was slowly consuming me. I didn't know how to stop it, or if I even wanted to. The more I tried to push my feelings away, the more intense they became. The more I tried to compartmentalize my professional role, the more I realized how little control I actually had. James had started to control my thoughts, my emotions, everything. And with each passing day, it felt less like I was his assistant and more like I was something else entirely. Here's Keynote 4 expanded to 500 words for, "I worked for him, but he was the one in control of my heart." #####Keynote 4. The moment I lost control, it started as a quiet storm, gentle, almost unnoticeable. But as the days passed, I felt the thunder building inside me, the pressure of everything I tried to keep hidden finally threatening to burst. The moment I lost control came when I realized I no longer cared about keeping my feelings in check. I had become obsessed with the thought of him, unable to focus on anything else. It wasn't just his power that held me captive, it was the way he made me feel. The way he made everything else seem irrelevant when he was near. The turning point came one afternoon. James had asked me to stay late at the office to finish some paperwork. At first, I thought it was just another late-night task. The usual end-of-day rush had me preoccupied, and I didn't think much of it. But when I walked into his office to hand him the files, the atmosphere felt different. He was sitting behind his desk, looking at something on his laptop, but when he looked up at me, there was something in his eyes, a hint of something I couldn't quite place. And when he smiled at me, it wasn't the usual polite, professional smile. It was something softer, more personal, something that made my heart skip. "You're the last one here," he said, his voice low. "You can head home once you're done. I don't want to keep you too late." But it wasn't the words that caught my attention. It was the way he said them, the way his gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. And suddenly, my mind was no longer on the papers in my hands or the task at hand. My mind was on him, his presence, his voice, the subtle way he leaned forward in his chair. Before I could stop myself, I found myself saying, "Actually, it's fine. I'm in no rush." And then it happened. He stood up from his desk and walked toward me. I stood frozen, trying to calm the rapid beating of my heart, but it was impossible. Every step he took seemed to echo in my chest. And when he stopped just a few inches away from me, everything else in the room faded away. He was close, so close that I could smell his cologne, feel the warmth of his presence, and hear the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was suffocating, and yet it felt like the most electric silence I had ever experienced. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't the words I expected. For so long, I had told myself that he was just my boss, that this attraction, I didn't know how to respond. I should have said something, anything to break the spell that had fallen over us. But instead, I just stood there, my mind racing, my body frozen. And then, before I could stop him, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingertips grazing my skin. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to send a rush of heat through my body. The space between us closed, and without thinking, I leaned in, just slightly, just enough for him to feel the shift in my body language. And that was all it took. His lips met mine in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, and all the years of suppressed desire, the unspoken tension between us, came rushing to the surface in a single moment. I didn't know how long we stood there locked together, but it felt like an eternity. When we finally pulled away, our faces were inches apart, our breaths mingling. For a brief moment, it felt like time stood still. But reality quickly set in. I had lost control. The professional distance that had once kept me grounded had evaporated in that kiss. And now I was no longer just his assistant. I was something else, something complicated, something dangerous. My feelings for him had been unleashed, and there was no going back. As I stepped back, my heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with what had just happened. This was no longer just a workplace crush. It was something real, something powerful, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Here's Keynote 5 expanded to 500 words for, I worked for him, but he was the one in control of my heart. Hashtag, 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 Keynote 5. The consequences of crossing the line, the kiss wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. After that night, nothing felt the same. I tried to convince myself that it had been a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness, something I could chalk up to a lapse in judgment. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The truth was everything had changed. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The next few days at the office were a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. I'd walk into work, only to find myself avoiding James's eyes, pretending that nothing had happened, even though every part of me was screaming with the memory of his touch. Every interaction felt loaded with meaning now, every word and glance fraught with unspoken tension. I was no longer just his assistant. I was someone who had been touched by him, kissed by him, and in some ways, owned by him. That was the feeling that lingered. He had claimed a part of me that I wasn't sure I could get back. At work, I kept my distance. I buried myself in my tasks, hoping that the professional boundaries we once had could be restored, hoping that the kiss would fade into nothing more than a momentary lapse of judgment on both our parts. But it wasn't that simple. Every time I saw him, every time he spoke to me, I felt the pull again, as if he were drawing me in without even trying. And what scared me most was that I didn't want to pull away. James, on the other hand, had become more elusive. It wasn't like he was avoiding me, but he seemed distant in a way that I couldn't understand. He was still kind, still professional, but there was a coldness in his demeanor now, a layer of ice that wasn't there before. He'd glance at me in meetings, his eyes flicking to mine for a split second before moving away quickly, like he was trying to remind both of us of the boundaries that should have never been crossed. I couldn't help but wonder if he was regretting what happened. Maybe it was a moment of weakness for him too, something that he wished he could undo. But what hurt even more than a sudden distance was the fact that I didn't know where I stood. The uncertainty gnawed at me, and I found myself second-guessing everything I had done, everything I had felt. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. There was no one to turn to, no one who would understand. If anyone found out, it could ruin me. I could lose my job, my reputation, everything I had worked so hard for. And yet, it didn't seem to matter. No matter how much I tried to focus on my work, my mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he made me feel, the way he held my attention without even trying. The real danger wasn't just the consequences at work. It was the emotional toll it was taking on me. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, and so dependent on someone else's approval and affection. James was no longer just my boss. He had become something more, something I couldn't control, and that scared me more than anything else. I was caught in a storm of my own making. The more I tried to pull away, the more I realized how much power he had over me. He had moved from being a mere figure of authority to someone who owned my thoughts, my emotions, and my heart. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every task, every meeting was tainted by the memory of that kiss, and every time he looked at me, I felt like he was reading my soul. I had crossed a line, and now I was living with the consequences. The only problem was I didn't know how to take a step back. Here's Keynote 5 expanded to 500 words for, I worked for him, but he was the one in control of my heart. Hashtag Keynote 5. The consequences of crossing the line, the kiss, wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. After that night, nothing felt the same. I tried to convince myself that it had been a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness, something I could chalk up to a lapse in judgment. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The truth was everything had changed. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The next few days at the office were a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. I'd walk into work, only to find myself avoiding James's eyes, pretending that nothing had happened, even though every part of me was screaming with the memory of his touch. Every interaction felt loaded with meaning now, every word and glance fraught with unspoken tension. I was no longer just his assistant. I was someone who had been touched by him, kissed by him, and in some ways, owned by him. That was the feeling that lingered. He had claimed a part of me that I wasn't sure I could get back. At work, I kept my distance. I buried myself in my tasks, hoping that the professional boundaries we once had could be restored, hoping that the kiss would fade into nothing more than a momentary lapse of judgment on both our parts. But it wasn't that simple. Every time I saw him, every time he spoke to me, I felt the pull again, as if he were drawing me in without even trying. And what scared me most was that I didn't want to pull away. James, on the other hand, had become more elusive. It wasn't like he was avoiding me, but he seemed distant in a way that I couldn't understand. He was still kind, still professional, but there was a coldness in his demeanor now, a layer of ice that wasn't there before. He'd glance at me in meetings, his eyes flicking to mine for a split second before moving away quickly, like he was trying to remind both of us of the boundaries that should have never been crossed. I couldn't help but wonder if he was regretting what happened. Maybe it was a moment of weakness for him too, something that he wished he could undo. But what hurt even more than his sudden distance was the fact that I didn't know where I stood. The uncertainty gnawed at me, and I found myself second-guessing everything I had done, everything I had felt. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. There was no one to turn to, no one who would understand. If anyone found out, it could ruin me. I could lose my job, my reputation, everything I had worked so hard for. And yet, it didn't seem to matter. No matter how much I tried to focus on my work, my mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he made me feel, the way he held my attention without even trying. The real danger wasn't just the consequences at work. It was the emotional toll it was taking on me. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, and so dependent on someone else's approval and affection. James was no longer just my boss. He had become something more, something I couldn't control, and that scared me more than anything else. I was caught in a storm of my own making. The more I tried to pull away, the more I realized how much power he had over me. He had moved from being a mere figure of authority to someone who owned my thoughts, my emotions, and my heart. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every task, every meeting was tainted by the memory of that kiss, and every time he looked at me, I felt like he was reading my soul. I had crossed the line, and now I was living with the consequences. The only problem was I didn't know how to take a step back. Here's Keynote 7 expanded to 500 words for, I worked for him, but he was the one in control of my heart. Hashtag Keynote 7. The breaking point. I had known for weeks that things were becoming impossible. The constant push and pull, the undeniable tension between James and me had been wearing me down. Every day, it felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, my heart and mind caught in a dangerous battle. I was slipping further into his orbit, and yet I knew that if I got too close, I might lose everything. But even knowing that, I couldn't stop myself. I had already fallen too far. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon, a day that started out like any other. We were in a meeting, surrounded by colleagues, discussing the latest project update. As usual, I tried to keep my head down, focusing on the task at hand, but it was impossible to ignore the way James kept glancing at me. Every time he spoke, his words seemed to linger in my ears longer than they should. His voice, usually authoritative, now felt more intimate, almost as if he was speaking directly to me and no one else. And the way his eyes would lock onto mine, even for the briefest of moments, sent a rush of heat through me that I couldn't control. The meeting ended, and everyone filed out of the conference room. I was about to leave when James stopped me with a simple, "Wait a second." His voice was soft but firm, the kind of tone that made my stomach flutter. He motioned for me to stay as the others walked out. My heart raced in my chest, and I had to force myself not to react. I tried to pretend that nothing had changed between us, but the truth was everything had changed. When the last person left the room, he closed the door behind them and turned back to face me. His eyes were dark, unreadable, as if he were trying to decide how to proceed. I could feel the tension building between us, the invisible thread that had been pulling us together for so long now, tightening with every passing second. "I think we need to talk," he said, his voice lower than usual, a note of something in it that I couldn't quite place, something heavier, more urgent. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth went dry. What could I say? How could I possibly explain what was happening between us when I didn't even understand it myself? "I don't think we can keep pretending that nothing's going on," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "You feel it too, don't you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to speak the truth I had been hiding for so long. I wanted to lie, to say that it was just professional, that we were imagining things, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was undeniable. I had been drawn to him from the very beginning. I had tried to resist it, to bury my feelings beneath layers of professionalism, but it was too late for that. "I feel it," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded, almost as if he had expected me to say that. Then, for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us stretched, heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. And then he took a step closer. The space between us felt small, too small, and my breath caught in my throat as he reached out, his hand resting on my arm. The touch was gentle, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. "I think we both know what's at stake here," he said, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "I don't want to lose what we have, but I also don't want to keep pretending that this, whatever this is, doesn't matter." I felt like I was losing control of everything. The fear, the desire, the overwhelming weight of the moment. Everything was pushing me to the edge. I wanted him. I wanted this. But the consequences of giving in were too much to ignore. My job, my reputation, my sense of self, everything I had worked for could come crashing down in an instant. But at the same time, I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. His hand slid down to my wrist, and for the first time, I realized just how close we were standing. His breath was warm against my cheek, and I could feel the tension between us, thick and suffocating. "I need to know what you want," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, "because I don't think I can keep going like this." I stood there, frozen, trapped in the web of my own feelings, unsure of what to say or do next. The decision I faced was impossible, the consequences too dire to fully comprehend. But in that moment, one thing was certain. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. James had always been in control of our professional relationship, but now I was starting to realize that he had also taken control of my heart, and I didn't know how to take it back.